Hello and welcome to this edition of RFE RLive, a program in which we gather a number of experts to discuss important issues involving our target region. In this show, I intend to have informal conversation and also encourage our audience to participate in the debate by submitting their questions through Facebook and Twitter using hashtag RFE RLive throughout the program. Today we are here to discuss new U.S. and Central Asia relations in the light of Secretary Kerry's visit to the region. We will be looking into particularly what Secretary Kerry was looking for in Central Asia, what did he achieve, and what does the timing tells us. To discuss the subject from Moscow, I have Ambassador Courtney Williams, who is currently Senior Fellow at the RAND Corporation, previously served as a U.S. ambassador to Georgia in Kazakhstan. From Bishkek, Steve Severtlu is joining us, who is the Central Asia Program Director at the Human Rights Watch. From New York, Dr. Alex Cooley is with us, who is Director of Harriman Institute at Columbia University and author of Base Politics, Democratic Changes, and U.S. Military Overseas. As always, here in Prague, I have my colleague Bruce Panier, who is the editor of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberties, Central Asia blog called Kishlak Ovozi. I am Mohammed Tahir, director of the Turkmen service at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, also host of the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberties, another podcast called Majlis, which also looks at the pressing issues of the day in Central Asia. Thank you for joining me, gentlemen, in this edition of RFE RLive. Dr. Cooley, Secretary Kerry's visit was an important trip. It was 23 years later since the first and the last U.S. Secretary of State was in Ashgabat, and I believe such high-level interactions between U.S. and Central Asian leaders are not common in the rest of Central Asia. So why he was there, what he was looking for in Central Asia, Dr. Cooley?
Well, I think the trip was intended a bit as a reboot and to try and reverse the perception that's quite common now that the U.S. is neglecting Central Asia and withdrawing from the region. So I think the 2014 timeline from Afghanistan had become a big narrative in the region. It signaled that though the U.S. had engaged with Central Asia, that it was a function of its campaign in Afghanistan. Now that it was leaving Afghanistan, it was no longer interested in the same type of robust engagement. So I think part of the trip was designed to try and give the appearance and the reassurance that the U.S. is here in a post-Afghanistan campaign and strategy. And I think you also see that in the tone of some of the initiatives that have been announced, some of the new aid initiatives, that the U.S. Has dropped a little bit this talk of fostering the new Silk Route, right? Because it's really China that's providing the resources for the new Silk Route, and instead it's doing things that it should be doing in a niche capacity, training of scholars, of experts, of small business people, putting in the Muskie Fellowships again, playing an active role in human capital and human dimensions. So all of that I think is good. I'm not sure it's going to reverse this perception that the U.S. is no longer engaged to the same degree as it was, but I think it's a step in the right direction.
Ambassador William Courtney, actually, this question might goes to you. How was it different, looking from Moscow, how was it different? This trip was different from the previous trips that U.S. Secretary of States have had in Central Asia in the past, in terms of messaging and in terms of the agenda which was discussed with Central Asian leaders?
Well, I think as Dr. Cooley points out, there's a lot of concern in the region that as NATO forces draw down in Afghanistan, that the West will be less interested in Central Asia. Previously, there was a lot of interest in developing what was called the Northern Distribution Network, a supply network through Central Asia, Russia, several other countries, to support NATO forces in Afghanistan. So this is a different circumstance. Second, the correlation of forces around Central Asia is changing a lot. Russia's economy is in decline, and it may be in decline for a little while. China's economy is growing rapidly, even at a slower rate than Xi Jinping has just predicted. So we're going to see interest in Central Asia, and the West remaining present, remaining involved to help them balance relationships at a time when the correlation of forces is changing so much. And this balance is not a balance in which the West is competing against China or competing against Russia for power and influence in Central Asia. It's a balance which ideally helps us with all of them, have good relations with all of the countries. And Kazakhstan, in some respects, is the very star in there. Kazakhstan has good relations with China and Russia, and has been able to take more advantage of those than some of the other Central Asian countries have.
Rose, before the program, we have been talking about this question a lot. What is, in your opinion, what's the difference between the earlier visits by the Secretary of State to Central Asia with the one with Secretary Kerry just had?
Well, you know, during the 1990s, the Secretaries of State would show up, and they did have, the U.S. had a rather expanding role at the time. We were not only engaged with the Central Asian governments as partners, but at that time it was possible to get them to open up non-NGO offices, different establishments, which we hoped were going to promote democratic reforms, institution building, things like that. Post 9/11, of course, the emphasis shifted a little bit, and a lot of our engagement, of course, was to shore up alliances that we had in the region with an eye toward Afghanistan. So this really marks, I would say, a new period in U.S. Central Asian relations, and the fact that we know that we can't go back to the way the situation was in the 1990s. Central Asia's moved on a little bit. Not only is Russia a partner, but now we got China, so they have new allies that can balance out relations with the U.S. with. We're obviously withdrawing from Afghanistan, and the drawdown is underway, so that is not going to be the key feature of U.S. Central Asian relations. So, you know, I think Dr. Cooley rightly said, you know, that this was kind of a reboot. We're trying to figure out where the common ground is in the relationship between the U.S. and Central Asia, and what are the common interests moving forward, since we know that the common interests they had in the past are not necessarily obsolete, but certainly not priorities at the moment.
Right. Here we also need to talk about the area which interests Steve, you and your organization. What difference you have seen in terms of the role of human rights or democracy in the agenda of Secretary Kerry compared to the previous visits by the Secretary of State?
Right, and thank you very much for having me. I should mention I'm Central Asia researcher, my actual title. You know, I think for those of us that care about the abysmal, generally abysmal state of human rights for the 75 million or so people across Central Asia, this week, you know, weeks like this don't come along very often. And there were a lot of high hopes, I think, on the part of many activists I've spoken with, relatives of political prisoners, that this could have been a breakthrough week. And you know, I think while Alex is certainly correct, and Bruce, that this was an attempt to reboot, this is a new period, there's some uncharted territory in terms of where the relationship's going. When it comes to the approach to dealing with human rights abuses, I think this week was largely a continuation of a soft, quiet diplomacy which is not getting results. So what we noticed, you know, certainly Secretary Kerry, who's known for being a powerful diplomat, someone that doesn't back down from difficult situations, who deals with Israel-Palestine and the toughest issues, he somehow seemed to be, you know, behaving himself in a way that was a little inappropriate, considering the severity of the abuses. So, you know, while certainly we saw that issues were raised, it was reported that political prisoners' names were handed over to President Berdimuhamedov, for example, in Turkmenistan. What we didn't see, what we missed, were tough public statements designed to show the Central Asian leaders that when it comes to human rights, the status quo is just not going to do. That the abuses have gotten so bad. For example, Tajikistan has gone off a cliff in the last month, and that simply didn't register, I think, in the sort of the symbolism of the visit and a lot of the statements that were made. We know that's difficult. We know that irritates these leaders. We know it's risky, but I think the human rights movement expected more publicly out of John Kerry this week. And while his address at Nazarbayev University was very important, it seemed again too general, a little bit too gentle, and lacking specific names and specific consequences that could be in store for the U.S. Central Asia relationship if the human rights situation continues to look so bad.
Right. I wish I would have a State Department representative to answer your questions here. But as a former diplomat, Ambassador Williams, do you agree, first of all, with what Steve's criticism was about?
The issue of how to handle human rights in Central Asia has been complex for a long period of time. I was not aware of any expectation that this was going to be a breakthrough visit for human rights. Quite the contrary, I think the Department of State has emphasized that security relationships and economic relationships would be the primary focus of Secretary Kerry's visit. It has been traditional, both with the Soviet leaders earlier and subsequently, to provide lists of specific political prisoners in private meetings with heads of state. Secretary Kerry did discuss human rights in a general but fairly forthright way in his speech at Nazarbayev University. But this is not a region that has experienced the Arab Spring. This is not Georgia, for example. Kyrgyzstan has had its tulip revolution and has a democracy that's making some progress, but this was probably not the time that the United States or Western countries in general believe that there is an opportunity for a breakthrough in human rights. What we see is a region that is fairly stagnant politically. It's been stagnant for a long time, and a risk that may be increasing is that the expectations for young people in the region, particularly educated young people, for greater opportunities to participate in the political process, those may be increasingly frustrating for young people, and that could lead to some unrest in the future.
Right.
Ambassador Courtney, I just had a follow-up here. If the conversation is about security and economics, I think most people believe that Russia is actually the ultimate guarantor of security, and China has stepped up as the ultimate guarantor of economics. So that kind of leaves the U.S. with a weak hand to play then, and what will we have to lose by pressing the human rights issue?
Well, the United States and Europe as well, the West, has a fair number of interests. One is energy, the Caspian energy. Second has been non-proliferation with Kazakhstan, where a tremendous amount of progress has been made. A third is helping to deal with the flow northward of violent extremist fighters and narcotics coming out of Afghanistan. As the NATO footprint there diminishes, those risks may increase, and we saw a reflection of that with the recent temporary takeover of Kunduz by the Taliban. So there's still a fair number of interests there that are important for the West. And for example, narcotics coming from Afghanistan often flow through Central Asia and end up either in Russia or in Europe. So Europe has a big stake in this as well.
Yeah. I think maybe if I could just jump in here, I think something else is also happening in terms of the environment. So one very important event was, of course, the Afghanistan drawdown post-2014. But the other very important event of recent years is, of course, the Ukraine crisis. And we in the West, we tend to think that the Ukraine crisis is a clear signal that Russia might be aggressive in the region, that all of these Eurasian leaders are concerned about similar incursions on their sovereignty and independence. If you're a Central Asian leader and you're hosting a Russian military base, perhaps these troops look very different now than they did pre-Crimea. But the flip side of the Ukraine crisis is a general fear of another Maidan, right, from the perspective of these regimes, that street protests with some sort of backing from the West, some sort of foreign funding, will bring down these regimes. And so Ukraine's a double-edged sword, and sometimes these are connected, right? A fear of a Maidan is also connected to a fear of a Russian intervention in response to unrest. So I think seminal events here are the color revolutions, the Arab Spring, but also the Ukraine crisis, I think has really heightened a sense of anxiety of a lot of these regimes, and a sense, along with the economic crisis, of deep uncertainty and potential instability in the region. And I think that's the context in which a lot of human rights advocates and champions are having to butt up against, that these regimes are really clamping down, trying to close down the political space.
Right. Here we are getting a question from Twitter, and this question actually goes to Ambassador Williams, to your address. Kerry said he would discuss human rights behind closed doors. Did he hold them accountable, mean the authorities in those countries? Will the U.S. withhold aid until something is done? Probably, this is something that obviously State Department can only answer, but the very relevant question to that is, when you ask State Department colleagues about whether a specific issue is being raised in this or that meeting, they would say those were raised, but in the private meetings. So you have been part of many such private meetings, Ambassador Williams. What does it mean, for example, when authorities, the State Department colleagues say that they are being raised in the private meeting? How do we understand this? How we should understand this?
Well, typically the President or the Secretary of State, in meeting with foreign leaders, will raise an issue in a general sense, but in some cases will raise specific political prisoner issues. So, for example, in the Soviet period, Dr. Sakharov, Sharansky were raised, a number of other folks, and some of those folks were released as a result of that. Whereas if the president had been too public, it might have gotten the backs up of Soviet leaders. With regard to aid, let's make a comparison. Ukraine and Georgia versus Central Asia. What we've seen in the West is a tremendous amount of support for democratic development in Ukraine and Georgia. They have become favorites of the West because they've made a lot of progress despite a lot of odds that are difficult. In Central Asia, we don't see that kind of enthusiasm from Western countries. We see a lot of pragmatic support for Kazakhstan because it's done so much in non-proliferation and economics and other areas. But the kind of public enthusiasm that we see for Ukraine and Georgia ought to be a reminder to all the states in the former Soviet space of what is possible when countries actually make real democratic progress, because that can inspire people abroad to provide levels of support that just otherwise wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
Can I jump in on that for one moment?
Actually, I just wanted to, and I suppose anyone can get this. That being the case, why isn't special attention given to Kyrgyzstan, which actually is more progressive, a little bit more forward than the other ones? We would figure out that if the message is the more democratic you are, the more progress you show, then the better your chances of having good ties with the U.S. It seems like, especially after this latest parliamentary election, this would be a good time to give Kyrgyzstan deals that aren't available to the other ones until they clean up their act, so to speak.
Well, generally, Kyrgyzstan has received slightly more favorable treatment in the West because of the Tulip Revolution and other things. But Kyrgyzstan has had a lot of ups and downs, even since the Tulip Revolution. So it's not quite the sustained democratic advance that we see in Ukraine and Georgia, and that's had a fair amount to do with it. Secondly, Kyrgyzstan is unusually poor. Per capita income in Kyrgyzstan is an order of magnitude lower than in Kazakhstan. So it reduces the possibilities of a lot of mutually beneficial economic interaction that could come Kyrgyzstan's way. Kyrgyzstan needs to make economic reforms, desperately needs to make economic reforms to match its democratic reforms if it wants to get expanded support from the West.
Right, all right.
I wanted to mention something. Ambassador Courtney mentioned Sakharov and Sharansky, and I think there are a lot of parallels or comparisons that can be made because, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan are about as Soviet as you get in terms of the political prisoner issue. And if I'm not mistaken, there was a time, certainly, these cases are raised privately, and we know they were. But if I'm not mistaken, Reagan, on one of his trips, went to see Sakharov, and he made it a public. That was a public display of diplomacy, saying, "I stand with you, the dissidents," and that is as important as my engagement with the Kremlin and with Gorbachev. And I think that's the sort of creative move that would have been warranted and certainly doable on this trip.
That was certainly one factor, but I think there's a couple of others. One is, I think, the rise of a lot of global media that relentlessly talked about U.S. hypocrisy, right? Sort of you had this split screen. Andijan's a really good example where Andijan is happening at the same time as the Iraq War, and so you get coverage from outlets in Russia or Al Jazeera showing this sort of split in kind of U.S. policy and character, that we're fighting for democracy and to install a liberal government in Iraq, and then in Uzbekistan we tolerate this. So, great powers always make compromises, right? Even if they have values and ideals, but part of what happens in this global media environment and with the rise of social media and all these new global TV outlets is that U.S. hypocrisy and its instant kind of magnification becomes a story in and of itself. And then the second thing, quite frankly, are exposures of counterproductive, hypocritical U.S. behaviors. I mean, Guantanamo Bay has been enormously destructive. Abu Ghraib, these images, the Snowden revelations, all of these have piled on to perceptions that the U.S. is not, a values-oriented actor. So I think, we're facing tremendous headwinds as a result of different things, but I think the security dilemma, the Russian media environment, sort of these revelations about the U.S. all don't help. Having said that, I still think that the U.S. does have significant moral authority, especially when it does make public statements. And so I think we need to realize that and not necessarily shrink away from dealing with these issues just because we're on the back foot.
Right, I see lots of frustration here. Security versus rights, as you said, Dr. Cooley. So while increasing its relationship with Central Asia, so what is the right balance from the Washington's perspective, Ambassador Courtney?
The balance depends on the country. It depends on timing. Depends on the nature of the governance system in each country. So, for example, in Kazakhstan has been a relatively more open country and has been quite cooperative on a number of important national security issues. And let's take nuclear weapons, which is a huge issue at the beginning, and non-proliferation cooperation has still been important. So U.S.-Kazakhstan relations have been quite close. But as I mentioned with Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, those security relationships have not been close, in great part because of the nature of the regime. It's not as though those countries don't face security threats from Afghanistan or elsewhere, but because of the nature of those regimes, the West just has not developed close security relationships. So there is a linkage there that's fairly clear. Dr. Cooley correctly points out that the image of the United States has changed. In the early 90s, I was in Kazakhstan. To borrow Alan Greenspan's phrase, there was a certain amount of irrational exuberance about the United States and the West coming to the rescue and humbling the Soviet Union. But as time went on, as people saw the nature of their own governments and the trade-offs that were made in their own lives and their country's situation, they began to see that it was much more complex. That said, the elites of those countries, they send their children for education abroad if they can afford it. They send them to Europe, some to America. They generally don't send them to China. If they can afford it, they don't send them to Russia. They send them to Europe and America. So the ideal of the West, not just materialistic, although that's very important, but the ideal of the West being a more just, fair society is quite important for people in the region.
Right.
I just wanted to bring up one point too, because Ambassador Courtney, you hit on one point that reminded me. We talk about the developing of democracies in the early days in the 1990s, and I know you were there in Kazakhstan right when it all started. I get the perception from talking to people in Central Asia, there's a lot of confusion about what democracy means, because the democracy that they're used to is what the governments tell them is democracy in their own countries. And I think this is one of the places where the U.S. fails to get a message across to the Central Asian people, is that democracy in Central Asia is not true democracy, or certainly not the way it's supposed to be practiced. I talked to people in the Fergana Valley more than once, and they've told me flat out that democracy has failed here. It has no future here. We've seen what it does for us, and there's nothing there. And I try to explain to them that this is not democracy. And I think this is one of the messages that America hasn't gotten through to the people of Central Asia, is at the least to make it clear that this is transitional and does not represent what democracy hopes to achieve, or you still haven't got there yet. I mean, I know Secretary of State Kerry alluded to some of this stuff in his speeches, but the general perception among the Central Asians is our governments tell us we have democracy and this isn't working for us, and so why should we listen to what the United States says?
Authoritarian governments have appropriated elections and NGOs to try to convince people that democracy is something that is not the freedom that we know it to be. So there are staged elections, and NGOs in this region, in this part of the world, are for the most part government-sponsored non-governmental organizations, not independent NGOs, as we know in the West. Let me add that RFE itself is a beacon of freedom in the region and is not to be underestimated. Broadcasters from RFE are famous in the countries to which they broadcast. They're inspirations to people. So there is no, the people in Central Asia are not bereft of understanding about some of the distinctions between freedom and democracy and their own circumstances. But they live in a world in which there are a lot of compromises which they have to make in their own lives, their families have to make, and certainly their governments make.
I would agree with that. You know, I would say that security, you asked what's the balance between security and human rights. Security is human rights, and human rights are security. You just simply can't have a secure Tajikistan going forward, for example, if you have what's happening now. 200 or between 100 and 200 approximately new political prisoners added to the country's prisons in just the last month or two with the closure of the IRPT. This is affecting the whole country. It's what's happening is the terrible legacy of the Civil War is coming back to haunt this country. It's putting Tajikistan on an extremely dangerous path. That's just one example. You cannot have a secure Tajikistan without human rights being protected. I think one good thing, I don't want to only criticize, I think one thing that came out of this trip that might help strike that balance is that during the meeting in Samarkand, there was this thing called the Samarkand Declaration, which was written up, which does mention human rights. Mainly it's in the last paragraph of what the five foreign ministers signed as their commitment, and it's not binding law since it's a declaration, but it is still, it's still reflective of the intent of the parties. They say that they resolve to protect human rights, develop democratic institutions and practices. This is the 5 foreign ministers of Central Asia, not just the United States. Protect human rights, strengthen civil society, and uphold the rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's really important. That's after a recitation of a lot of commitments to, cooperate against ISIS. So we see security and we see rights in the same document. And I think that's something that the State Department has to hold the Central Asian governments to. They've resolved to protect human rights. They're inextricably linked, and there can't be one without the other.
Right. It's obviously fascinating discussion, but we are just running out of time. Let's briefly talk here. What did Kerry take away from this very short breathtaking trip? Dr. Coley? Briefly, please.
What did Kerry take away? I think he tried to stake a claim in this sort of post-Afghanistan era in policy. I think he tried to demarcate a kind of a special niche that the U.S. can occupy and set of roles that it can play that will differentiate itself from Russia and China. Again, whether it's sufficient to reverse the perception of U.S. withdrawal, I think we'll have to wait and see.
Right. Bruce?
Well, it was a good reminder to come through, and it was a strong message that he went to all 5 countries in just a couple days, so I think it was valuable. Central Asia is heavy on symbolism, and it meant something that a high-level official like that came to the region and made a point of going to all the countries. So it keeps the U.S. on the map as far as the Central Asians are concerned, and hopefully it's a good building block for future relations.
Steve?
I hope what he's coming away with were some concrete things. Sometimes these things take a little time to trickle in, but of course we're eagerly awaiting news of any political prisoners that could be released. That's something that sometimes happens. It happened when Secretary Clinton was in the region, so I'm very hopeful that that will come out of this. I think, as Alex said, he did stake a claim. It was good that when he was here in Bishkek, that he defended the award by the State Department to Azimjan Askarov. The fact that he reiterated that award reflects the United States' commitment to his lifelong service to human rights. I think that was very, very important that he didn't walk back from that. And I think more can be done. So let's just hope that he looked into Karimov's eyes and he saw what's actually there, and that he'll think about it, when he gets back to Washington and say, maybe we have to be a little bit more robust going forward.
Right. Ambassador Courtney?
3 things. One, Secretary Kerry, I believe, conveyed the message that the United States does not want there to be a security vacuum in Central Asia as NATO withdraws or draws down in Afghanistan. Secondly, that the United States is not interested in Central Asia just for zero-sum great game brinksmanship with Russia or China. In fact, the United States thinks they should all work together. And then third, that the United States is open for more economic cooperation with those countries. But of course, the subtext of that is those countries have to make more economic reforms if they want to offer attractive opportunities for private investors.
Right. Thank you, Ambassador William Courtney, for your insightful thoughts. And also big thanks goes to Dr. Alex Cooley in New York, Director of Harriman Institute. Also, thank you, Steve Svertlo, Human Rights Researcher at the Human Rights Watch, Central Asia Researcher at the Human Rights Watch, and my colleague Bruce Panier, who's the editor of Qishloq Owazi, RFE Central Asia blog. Thank you very much for your time and participation for the discussion. And dear viewers, thank you very much for taking time to watch RFE Live. This is it from me, Mohammed Tahir, Director of Turkmen Service at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Thank you very much for watching RFE. Bye-bye.